Hello, you have a prepaid call from
Keith Jesperson,
Bruce Davis,
Patton Clark, Robert Barno.
Wesley Sherman.
Oh, well, first off, thanks so much for taking the time again. How are you doing? Safe and healthy in these crazy times?
Yes, absolutely.
Good.
Doing well, and I appreciate you inviting me back.
Oh, sure. I mean, you had a great conversation. For those of you who didn't hear the last podcast we did, go back and check it out. Especially we dive into your book, Why We Love Serial Killers, which is just an amazing book you can get on Amazon. And we're going to be talking about your new show coming up, which is really the last time I saw you at the Keswick Theater when you did your one-man show. What was that experience like putting it together? It wasn't just you. I mean, you had audio, visual, you had Q&A from the fans. And what was that experience like putting it all together?
It was absolutely an incredible experience, an opportunity to live discuss many of the topics and ideas that I've had for a long time, and get direct feedback from the audience, and consistently. One of the things that I was just incredible is no matter where I went. The audience was comprised of approximately 80 to 90% women. And I've always known that true crime tends to entice and be of appeal to women, but boy, did that come true in my live shows, and so that was an interesting asked of it. But to get that live feedback was really incredible.
No, it's funny. Actually, you took the thunder of one of my questions I was going to ask later, but I'll ask it now. I was going to ask you because I found that really, and I still find it amazing that the majority of my followers are women. I'm not a bad-looking guy, but I'm not Brad Pitt, so I know it's not for me. But I mean, the only thing I know there's a small percentage, a very small percentage. There's like a sexual attraction to serial killers, but it's not just that. I mean, the only thing I can wrap my mind around is there's something about a woman being maybe a little bit more empathetic than the man. I mean, something like empathy maybe to the victims or the serial killers. I mean, why do you think that is? Every true crime podcast, most of them are hosted by women. So there's something
That's
to
right.
it. But what do you make of that?
That's absolutely. And I think it's a multifaceted thing. You touched on an aspect of it, the empathy. And we as humans, I think, are empathetic creatures by nature. We tend to want to understand and empathize with all living things, good and bad. But I think that's particularly true of women. And so in the case of these individuals who do horrific things, women want to protect themselves first and foremost. They want to try to understand these individuals. And I've had women tell me that they're so interested in true crime because they want to know how to identify and protect themselves from becoming the next victim of Ted Bundy, or God forbid, marrying the next Ted Bundy. So there's that aspect of it. And I think then more generally, and this applies to both women and men, that these individuals do such horrific, completely just incomprehensible things. I mean, take Jeffrey Dahmer. Once you abduct, torture, kill, dismember, and eat someone, what's left? I mean, what more can one human being do to another? And to most of us, that's simply incomprehensible and very terrifying. And the fact that it's done by individuals oftentimes who seem so benign and so unlikely, like the Ted Bundys, like the John Wayne Gacy's, even the Dahmers, that just seem so, vanilla ice cream, if you will, that it's absolutely terrifying. It could be our next door neighbor. So I think part of the psychological attraction of it is that if I can somehow just wrap my mind around it, if I can comprehend it, if I can make sense of it all, then somehow maybe it's not so terrifying
Yeah.
after all, and I can sleep better at night. And I
Yeah.
think that is also very true for women. Women have, many women have told me that they have this fear of the stranger danger, the fear of being attacked or abducted or assaulted by the unknown stranger, and I think that ties in directly, with the attraction to these stories. And at another level, it's also what I like to call popcorn entertainment. And what I mean by that, it's a thrill ride. If you watch a Ted Bundy documentary, or Son of Sam, or whatever, it's an incredible suspense, and mystery drama.
Yeah.
And so at some level there, it just gets the adrenaline pumping like a roller coaster ride or a haunted house. And there's that, and which in fact is one of the things that I talk about, that the media tends to normalize these things and almost promote these individuals, especially the well-known ones like Bundy and Dahmer, that they become almost like pop culture icons. They are celebrity monsters, as I call them, and it normalizes their behavior. And then what happens is, as far as I'm concerned, Jeffrey Dahmer becomes a commodity and a caricature, very much like Freddy Krueger or Michael Myers in Halloween. And therefore the reality, the horrors of what they're doing to real people is lost, and they just become another form of entertainment. And then Dahmer doesn't become real, or Bundy, until they knock at your front door, and then they become very, very real.
Oh yeah, I mean that's part of why I do my podcast. We're having serial killers call me for the show, and especially ones that are open. Like Keith Jesperson, he's almost giving warnings. Hey, this is what to watch out for. Like you're hearing it from the serial killer's mouth. This is why I killed. This is the motivation behind it. And speaking to Keith, it's funny during your show at the Keswick Theater. And again, a great show. I can't wait to talk about the new tour, the new show coming up in Chicago. A packed house, amazing audience. But I thought I got to talk to you briefly after the show, and I mentioned, if you remember, that the happy face killer Keith Jesperson, who we'll talk a little bit about, called me during the show. And I obviously had an answer. But I just thought, well, how funny would it have been? I ran up to the stage. Hey, and I talked to Keith after that. He said he would have been happy to put on speakerphone to talk to everybody. I mean, what a ride that would have been. The audience get to talk to a serial killer. He would have did it too. I thought it was just funny. But
no, that is that would have been an incredible moment.
Oh, for sure. Now speaking of Keith, I kind of went viral. As you know, the happy face killer Keith Jesperson, who I've known for a while, wanted the mailing address of Rex Heuermann, the suspect in the Long Island serial case. And, I gave him the address, and obviously Rex wrote him back. Of all the people that have written Rex, which are hundreds and hundreds of people, he wrote Keith back, and obviously I have that letter. So I'm kind of still in the middle of going viral, but you yourself are a little bit viral right now, because I guess it was 2011, I think. I think the murders were around 2010, but I think around 2011, you came up with a profile that basically was so exact. The only thing missing was the guy's first name. Pinpoint that up. I think it might have been for the New York Times. I forget where exactly you broke the news at, or the profile at. How did you get that information, or what made you get to that point of pretty much dead on accuracy of who this person was going to be?
Well, I appreciate you asking the question, and I'll set the stage and take us back to 2010, and the Gilgo Four were discovered in December of 2010. Now, at that time, I was a tenured professor, criminology professor at Drew University in New Jersey, just outside of Manhattan, New York. And I was teaching courses about serial killers. In fact, I was doing extensive research at that time for my book, Why We Love Serial Killers, corresponding with David Berkowitz and Dennis Rader. And the New York Times got wind of my work. And then when the 7 additional bodies were discovered the following April, bringing the total to 11 there on Gilgo Beach, I got a call from the New York Times, and they asked me, they said, would you develop a psychological and behavioral profile of this unknown predator that we're calling the Long Island serial killer? And I said, sure. I did that. And as you said, I was able to develop a profile that was pretty much dead on. And when Huerman was captured, late or middle of last year, my phone just lit up because people referred back to the profile.
Yeah.
But specifically, how did I do it? Well, there's a gentleman that I'm sure you've heard of, and many of in your audience have heard of too. His name was Roy Hazelwood, and Roy Hazelwood was one of the big three original profilers, along with Ressler and
Douglas.
John Douglas. And in fact, Hazelwood was the one who came up with the infamous organized versus disorganized dichotomy for identifying serial predator crime scenes, and it's absolutely genius. I abide by it. I follow it, and I was corresponding with Hazelwood at that time, and we talked about it. And I said, Roy, based upon what we see here, I see very much of a BTK, Dennis Rader type character. I think that this is a very meticulous, cold-blooded, psychopathic individual, a sexual predator, a sexual narcissist, probably a family man, probably professional, who lives very close by in this case, the burial ground where he was dropping the bodies, probably absolutely invisible in plain sight, maybe even charming, probably very meticulous in his work. And Hazelwood agreed with me. And adding an additional element or stamp of approval, if you will, to my profile, I asked the same thing of Rader. I said, what do you make of this Long Island serial killer guy? Because I was corresponding with Rader at the time. And he said, he'll be a clone. Isn't that interesting?
Wow.
I interpreted that as meaning he'll be a clone of me. And he is. I mean, if you look at Rex Huerman, he is so similar to Rader. I think he is what is known as a power control killer, which means that it was the thing that really turned him on, the thing that really gave him satisfaction is not sex per se, but it was the domination of life, the extinguishing of life at his wish and demand. And look at the size of him. He's a giant. He's almost a giant. He almost weighs 300 pounds. And he picked these tiny sex workers, women who some of them weren't even 5 feet tall. Yeah. He wanted to tower over them. They were like toys for his amusement. So he very much fits in the line of a power control killer. And they typically are highly meticulous. They definitely psychopathic, cold-blooded, indifferent to the suffering of others, like to torture, like to torment. And it's all about the extinguishing of life. Yeah. So I had a little bit of assistance in developing that profile from two expert sources, Hazelwood and Rader. But it was gratifying, of course, when I found that my profile was really dead on. But more than anything else, I was glad that they finally had apprehended the person responsible.
Oh, of course. And you mentioned power control killer. Like I know Keith Jesperson. I mean, it sounds like it's very similar, to him also. One thing that Keith has said, like a lot of people clump everybody into one category of serial killers. They love to kill. But there's so much more to that motivation behind it, where Keith didn't so much say he gets, he doesn't go out specifically to kill. It's like when he snaps, his anger just gets the better of him, and almost like instantaneously. He's like hundreds of women he's hitchhiked on his truck across the country, but it's the ones who really kind of piss him off, and he snaps with it. Just briefly, how many different types of serial killers? Obviously, some have a thrill to kill. You mentioned a sexual aspect of it, but what kind of major types are there as far as motivation?
Great question, and we could spend definitely a whole episode just talking about this, because there is this myth that they're all motivated by the same thing, and usually it's sex. And that's just not the case. There are oftentimes sexual components to it, but sex is not necessarily the primary motivation. It can be secondary, and in some cases, sex is non-existent as a motive.
Yeah.
Let me give you an example of a type of serial killer who is not motivated by sex at all. And that is what is known as a mission killer. A mission killer is an individual who has the craving to kill, has this desire, this need to kill, but they feel that they need to rid the world. They're playing God, and they need to rid the world of a particular type or category of individual.
Yeah.
And there have been a number of serial killers, for example, who have targeted homeless men. One of them last year in Stockton, California, who was apprehended. So that's a motivation there that is not sexually motivated at all.
Yeah.
Now, about 50%, probably about 50% of all serial killers have sex as a motivation in some way, but many of them fall into this power and control category. And sex is not the primary motive for BTK, for John Wayne Gacy, for the Green River Killer, Hewerman, Jesperson. Sex was an element, but it was not the primary motive. I truly believe that power, domination, control, the need to extinguish life when they wanted to play God, was the primary motive. But the thing that all serial killers do have in common is that killing serves a fantasy need. They have a compulsion. It's almost like a visceral hunger inside of them that needs to kill. And it grows. It grows inside of them, and it reaches a tipping point. And when they hit that tipping point, they are powerless over it. And in many cases, they even try to understand it. Dahmer tried to understand it. Rader tried to understand it. Rader knew it existed, but he didn't know what it was, so he came up with a name for it. He called it Factor X.
Factor X,
yeah. And he knew this hunger when it was rising up in him, and he knew he couldn't control it, but he did want to try to understand it.
Yeah.
And in Rader's case, I think he actually resented the fact, being the control freak that he is, that he couldn't control Factor X.
That's a good point.
Which is one of the which is one of the reasons that he engaged in autoerotic fantasy, and would relive his killings and sexually release himself, and thereby delay killing for long periods of time, because I think part of it was he wanted to prove to himself that I can control this thing.
Oh yeah, that's wild. And speaking of Rader, I mean, just from my phone rings off the hook all day with different ones from around the prison facility. And they had all mentioned, and I think Rader even talked about it too, as you get older, when you hit 50, 60, they said, they're not as strong as they were. So it's almost like, the killing slows down, or they get married and they have children. With Rex, it's been a while, 2010. Do you think, obviously speculation, do you think there was murders before 2010? And between 2010 until he got caught, that's a lot of time. I mean, do you think there are going to be more bodies discovered or different maybe burial grounds? Because even though they get older, I mean, not that he's past his peak, but it seems like earlier on, before 2010 and 2010, that was his prime, so to speak, if you're going by serial killer timelines, where they slow down a little bit. I think it's like a cooling off period. I think I heard you say one time where sometimes I can get a longer and longer span of time the older that they get. But do you think we're going to find about even more bodies from Rex?
Well, you asked several good questions there, and let's start broadly. Do I think that he is responsible for possibly more of the victims that were discovered there, or I should say the bodies that were discovered on Gilgo Beach, in addition to the Gilgo 4, the other 7? I think it's quite possible and quite likely that he's responsible for one or more of those. Is it possible that he is responsible for killings even outside of New York? Remember, he had a home in Las Vegas, and he also had another home in South Carolina. So is it possible that he killed there? Yes. In fact, if I was a betting man, I would say that it's very likely that he has other as yet undiscovered victims. But is it likely that they occurred before the Gilgo 4? Probably not,
Mm.
because most serial killers start very close to home where they
Oh,
feel
okay.
comfortable.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
and I suspect that the Gilgo Four may have been, his original
Mm.
and first victims.
Mm.
But did he stop after they discovered his burial ground in December of 2010? No, I don't think so.
Wow.
Serial killers, they're like cockroaches. They adapt. They change to fit the circumstances and the environment. Why? Because again, killing is a compulsion. It's something that they need to do. So
Yeah.
they will change the conditions and the environment if necessary in order to continue to try to satisfy that need.
Yeah. Now, when somebody, you mentioned different types of serial killers, and so when they get older, they maybe slow down a little bit. But is it
Yes.
like, is certain types, like with the power control killer, is that a type that is more likely to slow down, maybe stop by themselves? Or it's like, once a dog gets a taste of blood, they're not going to stop. I mean, they might slow down a little bit, but is there a one type, specifically the power control killer, that you can stop? You can stop, or is that urge just too strong and it's just impossible?
Just in general, it's unusual for serial killers to stop of their own volition. They just as no one wakes up one day and says, this is a great day to become a serial killer. It follows a progression
Yeah.
over 10, 15 years, oftentimes until they reach that tipping point, as I say, where they need to kill. Well, the same thing happens with stopping killing. It just doesn't happen, overnight. And the power control killers, it's interesting, you bring that up. These are physical killings. They often are stranglers. BTK was a strangler. Jesperson was a strangler. I believe that Huerman was a strangler. And that takes physical strength.
Yeah.
And oftentimes, as young men, they will prey on young women. But isn't it interesting, as BTK aged, he would increasingly target older women. He was no longer going after the 20-year-olds.
Yeah.
He's now going after the 65-year-olds.
Yeah,
so he was aware. I think he definitely was aware of his own increasing physical limitations. Do they age out per se, that they simply reach a point where they say, I can't do it anymore? I wouldn't say that that's the case, but they do recognize their own increasing limitations. Serial killing is not an endeavor for an elderly person, that's for sure.
For sure. Now, what did you make of the letter? Now, I know, just from my followers, I know at least a few dozen people who have written to Rex. I'm sure, from his letter to Keith, he said he's getting, countless letters from other people. He chose not to respond to anybody except another power control killer, until Keith. What did you make of the fact that he wrote a serial killer, or wrote back to one, and just the contents of the letter itself? What did you make out of all that? It's just wild.
Well, it doesn't surprise me at all. Many serial killers are what I would call students of the game. They study each other. They're interested in each other. And in many cases, they're jealous of each other. BTK was jealous of the notoriety that David Berkowitz received. He was extremely jealous. He told me that he was jealous of the notoriety that Berkowitz received, and so they are interested in one another. So it doesn't surprise me at all. They are even somewhat competitive. For example, when I told Rader that I was corresponding with Berkowitz, his reply was, "Ugh, he's not a man. He's a shooter. Real men strangle. Real men get up close." So he had to belittle Berkowitz.
Wow.
So the fact that there would be interest there on the part of Huerman doesn't surprise me at all.
Wow. One thing that Keith had told me earlier on, I mean, Keith's at a part of his facility that has an honor unit, if you will. He has access to all kind of TVs and pretty much, there's a putt-putt golf course out back for the honor unit. It's a whole different kind of facility there. The one thing he said right away, he actually thought there was a very good possibility his wife is going to be involved somehow, not so much in the murders, but maybe more of a sexual aspect of it. And then when we come to find out that some of her DNA was found on some of the bodies, I mean, it could be just coincidence, of course, transfer DNA. But it struck me very odd that, it's typical from BTK's wife and many serial killers' wives or girlfriends. Once the truth comes out, they disappear. We usually never hear from them again. But with her, the divorce seemed to be, right away. But then, supposedly she signed like $1 million deal with this streaming company. Documentary crews following her around. Shows up in a fancy car at the courtroom a few months ago, smiled at each other. It's like, what do you make of her maybe an involvement in it, no involvement in it, but what do you have to say or about, I think Asa is her name. Do you think she's involved at all or just coincidence? It's sketchy. It just seems sketchy to me.
Yeah, well, they had an estranged marriage from what I understand, and the fact that she would now try to capitalize on it could suggest that she's somewhat of a a cold individual herself. Do I think that she was in any way involved? No, I don't.
Okay.
Serial killers typically, there are serial killers who have partners, like the Barbie and Ken killers, for example. But generally speaking, they're solo predators, and the reason for that is the psychological fantasy need that drives them to kill is so individualistic, it's so idiosyncratic that they just don't share it with another person.
Okay.
And so the BTKs and the Huermans and the Jespersons and the Bundys tend to be very, very secretive. They tend to have these alter egos, if you will, or these normal personas that just seem so innocuous because they're hiding things from the world.
Yeah.
So people have asked me the same thing. Do I think that Rader's wife was in any way involved? No. Do I think Huerman's wife was in any way involved? No. I don't believe so. She just may be a bit Machiavellian or greedy to the extent that she'd like to try to cash in some way.
Now, obviously speculation, but how do you think this trial is going to play out? I mean, obviously, the potential of more bodies in that, but do you think he's going to continue with his not guilty plea? I mean, the reason Keith reached out, one of the reasons, was to encourage him to get this over with. I mean, plead guilty. They seem like they have you to rights, because if you go to a prison facility with that much popularity, you're going to have even more of a target on your back. He actually wanted to get him make a plea deal to get out of New York, get out of a place that has a death penalty, and whether it's come to his facility or somewhere where it doesn't have the death penalty. But your best guess. Do you think he will eventually plead guilty to it, or do you think he's going to ride it out until get to trial?
Well, the short answer is he's going to do whatever it is that feeds his narcissism.
Yeah.
And an individual, and I truly believe, although they haven't done a forensic analysis of him, or if they have, they haven't released it yet. But I suspect that he is definitely a profound psychopath, and what is also known as a malignant narcissist. Now, what is a malignant narcissist? It's a narcissist who obviously, by definition, is completely self-absorbed, indifferent to the needs of others, but add torture and cruelty to it. So his narcissism actually feeds off of the tormenting and suffering of others. So he's really a diabolical individual. Now, if he's similar to a Bundy, for example, he may milk this. He may just enjoy the spotlight and milk it as long as possible to get, squeeze every drop of publicity and notoriety and infamy out of it. But I could also flip that script, and he could go the way of Rader and say, you know what? Okay, you got me. But now let me step out on stage and tell you how brilliant I am and how I got away with this for years, and you fools couldn't catch me for all those years. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So he's gonna do whatever suits and feeds his narcissism. Right now, he's rejecting the idea. He's rejecting the idea of admitting it, and which leads me to think that he may be more in the, like I said, the Bundy vein of things. That he's going to just sit back, play cat and mouse, and enjoy the ride.
Mm-hmm. Now, I recently had somebody who was part of your book, and it was part of your show last year. Dana Gray came back on my podcast. We did a video podcast. Like people like her, the topic was life without parole, or LWOP, as they say, or the other death sentence. I mean, she seems a little bit more on the repentant side of things. I remember, have you talked about her, reaching out to BTK, and I didn't know that story. And I've known Dana for 5 or 6 years, and then I think I emailed you and mentioned it to you, where from her explanation wasn't so much of looking up to him, but she wants to see if she was just as evil as other people were. She wrote to a couple serial killers, and she's like, "No, I'm not anything like them." Which maybe not true. I'm not 100% sure. But with life without parole, this is a very touchy subject with a lot of people. Obviously, the death sentence itself is too. But for somebody like Keith Jesperson, Dana Gray, and now with Rex, if he's found guilty, what are your thoughts on life without parole? I mean, we're one of the few countries that have that. Even, the United Nations calls it inhumane. It's a weird way it's hard to look at it, because one aspect of it, these are inhumane people who've done multiple serial killings. But are we as a nation inhumane to say we're not even going to give them a chance for parole or be rehabilitated? It's a touchy subject, but what are your thoughts on just prisons in general that have life without parole? Do you think everybody deserves a chance to be paroled, or no?
Well, this is such a multifaceted topic. There are religious aspects of this, moralistic aspects of it, practical aspects of it, even financial aspects to all these questions.
Yeah.
And let me start first and foremost by talking about the death penalty.
Mm-hmm.
I am not a fan of the death penalty, because I think that it's wrong to play God and kill another human being, whether you are doing so in the confines of a prison, an execution, or whether you're killing them on the street like BTK.
Sure.
I truly believe taking another life is wrong. Now, in the case of life sentence, the thing about someone like that I know well, like BTK, or for that matter, Bundy, these individuals are wired differently at birth. They are psychopaths and narcissists. And science has actually shown that the brains of these individuals function differently than you and I. And therefore, the idea of redemption or rehabilitation really doesn't exist. Individuals like this can be managed. They can be managed very well in a controlled environment because they're reward-based. And so, for example, BTK complies with all the rules in prison, and he's bragged to me about how he complies with all the rules. Why? Because on Saturday, he gets chocolate pudding and French fries. Exactly. Exactly. It's crazy. But so it's interesting. They can be managed, but they can't be rehabilitated. A guy like BTK, now, of course, he had a stroke, and he's very weak, and I don't know how much time he's got left. But a guy like him, if he was younger, if he was still in his 40s and he was back on the street, Factor X is going to rise up, and it's just going to be a matter of time before he has that compulsion to kill again. It doesn't go away. So there are certain individuals that, like it or not, I think need to be off the street, if that answers your question.
Yeah. I mean, even like David Berkowitz, who obviously we both know pretty well. Or I just got a Christmas card from Bruce Davis from the Manson family. Like 3 people that I would say have a good shot that I think have been rehabilitated. And I think if I was to pick 3, Charles Tex Watson, Bruce Davis, and David Berkowitz being more of the famous, more of the serial killer aspect of it, where if they were paroled, I would give them a good chance. Like Tex Watson, Bruce Davis, I would put money on they would be okay. Dave Berkowitz, I would lean money towards the director that he would be okay. But during your show, the area what I was sitting at, when you had mentioned David Berkowitz being a Christian, I'm not sure if you heard it or you did multiple shows. There was an audible groan.
Oh yeah.
of disgust, of like, it's
Hmm.
not possible, forget about. Now, obviously, me and you know David a little bit more on the personal level. You've seen his tears. I mean, I've heard his tears. You
Hmm.
want to talk about that. And again, it could all be a show. He could be fooling both of us. But I would lean money
Hmm.
that, I think he is more remorseful and maybe can feel empathy a little more than others. Have you
Hmm.
gotten a little bit of a pushback or a little bit of heat when you talk about, hey, I think he's maybe not changed for parole, so to speak, or set free, but you've definitely personally seen a big change in him when you spend almost a whole day one-on-one with
Yes.
him. Have you gotten a little pushback from that? Like, oh, that's impossible. He's not a Christian. He's not a changed man. What have you heard back,
I
if anything?
I would say more than a little pushback. I've gotten tremendous
Oh,
pushback.
wow. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, yeah. And that has something to do also with our culture and that the way that these individuals are presented and portrayed in the media.
Hmm.
They become what I use the term reductionism. In sociology and criminology, we use the word reductionism. We don't understand them, so we just put the stamp of evil on them. And
Hmm.
once something is evil, by definition, it can't be redeemed. You know what I'm
Yeah.
saying? It's either evil or it's not. And so once you stick that, and arguably, with the exception of possibly Charles Manson, there's no more quote evil character in the 20th century than the Son of Sam. I mean,
Yeah.
he's almost the poster boy
Yeah.
of of evil.
Hmm.
So it's hard for a lot of people to open their mind and accept the possibility that maybe this man has been, been changed.
Yeah.
People ask me, "Do you believe him?" Well, I'll tell you this: I believe that he believes it, and
Yeah.
I have a
Yeah.
PhD. But my PhD is not in spiritual conversion. It's
Sure.
not in Christian rebirth. So
Yeah.
I really don't have the tools, to analyze that. But I will tell you that I was personally moved when I sat in front of him and
Yeah.
I heard him describe his contrition and his remorse, for the things that he had done.
Yeah.
Now, does that mean that I think in his elderly years he should be back on the street? I'm not saying that,
Sure.
but I'm saying that he. I saw a changed man. I didn't see the dark, sullen young man that we remember, from the 1970s. He's a different person now. If
Yeah.
it's hard to imagine, but he's not very tall. He's a little chubby. He's
Yeah.
bald. He's got these big red rosy cheeks. When he came bounding into the commissary cafeteria area to meet with me and gave me this big hug, he looked like a backyard gnome. He looked like a
Yeah.
ceramic backyard gnome
Yeah.
with smiling and grinning, and I didn't find him frightening at all. In fact, the correction officers there, at that time, he was still in Sullivan Correctional Facility. They were more frightening. The correction workers were way more frightening than Berkowitz.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, yeah, yeah. It's so yeah. I do believe that Berkowitz has changed, but that
Yeah.
doesn't mean I necessarily think he should be back on the street.
Sure.
And even he told me, he said, Scott, I know that I'm never going to be paroled. He said, yeah, from time to time I come up and, I appear before the parole board.
Mhm.
I know I'm never going to get out. And I really, I believe I'm where I should be.
Yeah.
But he does have an incredible following.
Yeah.
People all
Mhm.
over the world who look to him as a symbol of rebirth and redemption.
Mhm.
And he corresponds with people all over the world. There's a website, as I'm sure you know,
Yeah. Mhm.
dedicated to him and his ministry, if you will.
Yeah.
And if that gives people comfort, and if he's doing good by simply, spreading his words, then let him do it.
Yeah.
Let him do it.
Sure. Definitely. Why do you think now? I mean, the heyday of serial killers, we talked a little bit about last time, the 70s around that time frame. But now you can't turn on the TV without something true crime. Why do you think
Hmm.
now the media has exploded so much instead of, they're not as many as there were back in the day? Um, but why do you think now it's exploded like it has been?
Well, it's a combination of factors. Some of it is technology. My grandfather, who if he was alive would be about 120 years old,
Mhm.
but he was a huge true crime fan, and he was reading those pulp magazines back in the 1950s and 1960s, like True Crime Confidential, and
Okay.
that kind of stuff, where they had the scantily clad women on the covers,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
it
yeah.
was very lowbrow stuff. It was like you didn't talk about reading these magazines, at that time. But now it's become high production value. You have people like Dick Wolf, who's mainstream media involved in these things. You have, the biggest production companies in the world involved in creating these documentaries and shows. So it's just sort of come out of the closet, if you will,
Yes.
as a way to put it. And it's become more acceptable, and again, the money that's being spent on it now, the production values, the quality of it, it's not this sort of grainy, low quality stuff anymore like it used to be.
Yeah.
That's part of it. But I think there's a broader question, and that is, and I get questioned all the time. People will say to me, "So are serial killers responsible for most of the homicides out there?" And I said, "Well, believe it or not, of the 20,000 or so homicides that are committed annually, which is a good number for the current, no more than 1% of those, or 200 of those murders are committed by serial killers.
Yeah.
But they receive far more than the lion's share of publicity and notoriety because they're so compelling, and that leads us to believe that they're more prolific and there are more of them out there than there really are. And that's always been the case, even back in the 1970s and 1980s, which was the sort of heyday of serial killers. But the number of serial killers has dwindled dramatically. There were probably in the 1970s somewhere in the neighborhood of 650 serial killers active during that decade. During the 1980s, it probably went up to 850 or more. Currently, in this decade, maybe somewhere between 25 and 50 operating. Now, why is that? And it's a combination of factors. Some of it goes back to our friends like Hazelwood and John Douglas, and in Quantico. They developed the profiling techniques back in the 1970s. They didn't even until 1974. The term serial killer wasn't even used. They were called mass murderers, and they were lumped together with, therefore, public shooters, school shooters, that sort of thing. And we just didn't understand them. So the 1970s, 1980s, they became much better at identifying and detecting and ultimately apprehending these individuals. And so when you develop new tools and you use those tools a lot, you're going to find a lot of what you're looking for, which led in many ways to the, that being the heyday. But since then, the detection tools have gotten better, and DNA, of course, has also been very responsible for solving cold cases like the Golden State
Bridge,
Killer, as well as BTK. It was his daughter's DNA that ultimately did him in. So I have a theory, and it's a theory that you can't really prove because you can't prove something that didn't happen. But what I truly believe is that individuals who are fledgling serial killers and could perhaps go on to become prolific serial killers are being caught after their first murder and technically don't become serial killers. And an example of that, I think an excellent example of that is Brian Kohberger. Brian Kohberger, is charged with a mass murderer. I mean, technically, it's a mass murder of 4 individuals, students there in Idaho. But I've studied him extensively. I've looked at his progression over the years, and I think that he has that there was a tremendous likelihood that if he hadn't been apprehended, he would have gone on to become a serial killer. If you remember, BTK, his first murder was a mass murder. The family that he killed there in Kansas, the Otero family. The Otero family. 4 members of a 7-member family. And in many ways, BTK's progression looks very similar to Kohberger's progression.
That's amazing.
You mentioned, it would be interesting, I think, to tell the story, if it's okay with you, about how how Dana Sue Gray popped up with BTK.
Sure, of course.
So, and this again, I'm with you. Not all serial killers are psychopaths, and I think it's quite possible that Dana Sue Gray is looking for answers and trying to see, whether she's like some of these more diabolical individuals.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not the way Rader received
Sure.
her correspondence. So let me tell you how this all happened.
Mm-hmm.
So I was in the midst of corresponding with Rader, and I received a package from him, and it wasn't unusual for me to get cards and drawings and all sorts of things from him. But what jumped out in this package was this beautiful hand painted pen and ink postcard on really heavy stock. It was a handmade postcard, and I flipped it over, and it was signed Dana Sue Gray. And I thought, oh my God, what is this? And because I knew who she was, and I hadn't corresponded with her, but I knew who she was. And so I go on to read the letter from Rader, and he says, Scott, I received this from Dana Sue Gray. It's a love note. She has a crush on me, but who does she think she is? She only killed 3 people. So I was re-gifted this postcard, from Dana Sue Gray simply because it didn't meet his standards.
Oh, that's great.
Isn't that crazy?
It's so wild. I could definitely see him doing that. 100%.
Yeah. Literally, he said, "Who does she think she is?"
Yeah. Oh, that's amazing. And what's
know.
wild that he sent me a few things over the years, but it's wild to see. You would think if you mentioned, and maybe we'll do another podcast about true crime art and murderabilia another time. But when people think of BTK and what he's bind, torture, kill, and all the sadistic things that he's done, you think of his artwork as going to be dark and scary. He draws puppy dogs, haikus,
and flowers,
poems,
and
and flowers, and bumblebees. He loves to say "busy as a bee," and he'll draw a little bee in a letter.
Yep.
Did you make anything of that, or is that's just him? I think he calls it like that cube or compartmentalizing everything. That's the last thing you would think. You get a letter from BTK, and there's a haiku about the springtime and bumblebees and happy. It's mind blowing. It's like another reality.
Yeah, it is, and that gets to what in psychological terms we call compartmentalization. He has his own word for it, cubing, as you said.
Mm-hmm.
And so what this does is it serves the purpose of him having any sort of cognitive dissonance or creating anxiety or stress by saying, how can I simultaneously be a Christian, a Lutheran church leader, a father and happy family man, and sadistic killer, torturer and killer? How can you make peace with all of that? Well, he makes peace with it by saying that these are just separate realities. These are separate worlds. And he's not, he doesn't have a multiple personality disorder. He's not Sybil, it's not like that. It's just that when he is in each one of these frames or cubes or compartments, it's simply a different world for him, and nothing else exists. Which is fascinating that his psychopathic and narcissistic mind allows him to do that. But that's how he sleeps like a baby at night. He absolutely sleeps like a baby. And one of the frightening things about BTK that I found through my correspondence with him is that you never really know when he's corresponding with you what compartment you're hearing from. Are you hearing from daddy? Are you hearing from the sadistic killer? You don't really know, because he lies. He's a liar, and he's a chameleon, and he compartmentalizes. So you never really know which one of his realities you're necessarily hearing from. But it really is a source of self-protection and, if you will, rationalization. It's the way he neutralizes and rationalizes his own culpability. He's even taken it so far with me as saying, Scott, how dare you or society in general condemn me for the things that I do? I am a natural born predator. God created me the same way he would create a serpent or a shark, and I was born to be a predator. So how can you say that I am wrong for doing God's good work?
That's amazing. Definitely
Yeah,
amazing.
yeah.
And you,
We in criminology we call that neutralization. What he's doing is he's neutralizing his own culpability and saying, he's turning the tables on us.
yeah,
He's saying, that we're wrong for condemning him for doing what he's born to do.
yeah. And in one sense, one of my books, I wrote a little bit about this. Certainly not, giving it any positive light, but I do try not to say make an argument. But when somebody's born with a brain abnormality, that I call it like when your amygdala, especially the part that holds the fear and all that, if it's damaged or a tumor's growing against it, but especially if you're born like that, it's not like you're condoning what they do, but it's almost like, I want to say empathy is probably too much of a strong word, but sometimes it kind of jumps on top of their free will, in a sense to where some of them can't stop. It's uncontrollable. So of course they're going to be killers, but it's like,
Yeah.
it's like there's evil people in the world, but then there's people with brain abnormalities who do evil things. Like I try to make a little bit of a distinction, not that we should be less, punish them less, but like more for awareness at least. Hey, you have that evil things, but let's look at why. At least bring some of that awareness out to the neurology aspect of it. But it's hard.
Yes.
It's crazy.
Well, let me comment on that. So, because these individuals do these incomprehensible things, as I mentioned before, society, the average person isn't going to spend the time to think about Berkowitz or think about Rader or think about Dana Sue Gray. They just hear what they do and they automatically put the label of evil on these individuals. The media do it, the news media do it. Many law enforcement professionals, correction officers, and the public at large. Why? Because once I put that label of evil on it, I don't need to think about it anymore. I figured it out. Now I can just go on about my life. You know what I'm saying? But those of us like you and I and social scientists and criminologists and forensics, psychiatrists that spend more time thinking about it realize that there's not like there's an evil gene. I don't believe that there's an evil gene that people are born with and say, oh, well, throw that one away. He's born with the evil gene. No, someone who's born a psychopath. And once again, I truly believe that the psychopathic realm is biological in nature. It's an abnormality of the brain. And therefore, these individuals don't have control. They don't have proper control over what they do. It doesn't mitigate their guilt. It doesn't mean that they aren't guilty, but at least it helps us to understand it and make sense of it all. And it also gives us things to look for, because psychopathic individuals, truly profoundly psychopathic individuals, do have things that will give them away. Even as a child, if you have a child who seems to delight in the torture and torment of animals, or their siblings or their classmates, seems to enjoy watching people suffer, that is a tell. That is something that you should really, get professional help for. Even if they don't have proper affect. If you have a child who does not respond to stimuli the way one would expect. They don't laugh when you think they would laugh. They don't cry when you think they would cry. They don't respond to pain or fear the way you think they normally would. These are things you might want to take a look at, because psychopaths do have traits that can be identified and perhaps derailed. If we had been able to derail BTK or Jesperson or Bundy at an early age, when, at a fledgling age, when these tendencies were just percolating inside of them, maybe we could have gotten them off that path.
Exactly. Well, we can talk all day long, and I'm sure the listeners can listen to you talk all day long. But why don't we wrap it up? You are doing another show, at least one show that I know of. I don't know if you have more dates, but this one's in Chicago, Thursday, April 11th at 7 o'clock. At the City Winery in Chicago. Now, if it's still set up the same way I've seen it before, it's like table and chair set up, almost looks like an old jazz club. It's a big, long, narrow building. It's a beautiful place. Tell us a little bit about what we can expect on Thursday, April 11th at 7 o'clock.
Well, thank you for that segue, and I'm really excited. I mean, I'm developing the show right now, and what I've realized, because So many of my followers and the audience are women. We picked this really beautiful wine bar, and it's a Thursday night, so it's a perfect girls' night out there in Chicago. Bring your friends. I've had at some of my shows. I've literally had 3 generations. I've had grandma, daughter, and granddaughter. Come to these shows. So we're hoping to entice these people to come.
Sure.
And I'd love to spend the evening. But in terms of what can they expect, well, I'm going to take you inside the minds, up close and personal, with serial killers, including those that I'm intimately familiar with, such as David Berkowitz, BTK, and of course Rex Heuermann. And I'm going to go into more detail about how I identified and profiled Heuermann. And one of the things that people just seem to love, it's a 2-act show. The first act is more about the background, and let's talk about motivations and identification, and how these individuals develop, and where they come from. And then the second half of the show is really a lively, interactive Q&A discussion, where I take questions from the audience in advance. When people come in, there's going to be actually a QR code up on the screen that you can scan with your phone and send me a question directly, and I'll get it backstage before the show starts. And so I'm going to answer a good 30 minutes worth of questions in the second act. Nice. And people just seem to love that. Because here's an opportunity to ask any question you ever wanted to ask about serial killers, and I'm there to answer it for you. So these shows, it's very interactive and multimedia. I have video, lots of photographs. I explain things, but I do so in a really, really lively and entertaining manner. So I hope to have a great crowd and a great evening there in Chicago on April 11th.
Well, if it was anything like the show in Keswick Theater that I saw, it's going to be tremendous. Everybody had a blast, even before the show. Tables are set up, people Q&A. It's funny because the guy running the table, Joe, from the Grimm Theater tour the Grimm tours in Philadelphia, I know really well. So we got to hang out. Some people on my podcast were there. It's like a community. I mean, it's just a true kind of community. Everybody's friendly and caring and loving. It was great. Everybody had a great time. You're kind enough to spend a little time with, some people at the end, signing some books at the end. But if it's anything like the show in the Keswick, it's going to be great. Everybody's going to love it. I encourage everybody who's in that Chicago area, the City Winery, Thursday, April 11th at 7 o'clock to check it out. Well, Dr. Scott, again, it was great talking to you again. I'm sure we'll do it again in the future. And just thanks so much. I really appreciate you taking the time. And I'm sure this tour, if you're going to do, even after this, is this just a one-night tour, or are you going to do any other cities after this?
This is the first leg. From there, we do expect a rollout, and you can look for details on that at my website, docbon.com. But I think you're going to post the website link for the Chicago show. Definitely. But you can go to chicagowinery.com/Chicago/events as well.
Perfect. Well, thank you for your time. And I said, I'm sure we'll meet up in the future.
All right. Thank you so much, Keith.
Thanks a lot, Doc. We'll talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Well, there you have it, Dr. Scott Bonn. Join us for the second time. Again, if you haven't seen the first podcast, go back on the audio podcast on Spotify or anywhere a podcasts are hosting. He really gets even more in-depth, especially about his book, Why We Love Serial Killers, which you can get on Amazon. I highly recommend it. But it was such a great live show that I saw at the Keswick Theater. Very personable. Again, he mentioned about the QR code to do questions. Last time it was like a table set up. You can put questions in a little jar. So if it's a good question, I'm sure he's going to answer it. He spends a lot of time with the Q&A, which is really good. But it's just a great show. It's funny, interactive. Again, he has some video in the background playing. It's definitely worth checking out if you're in that area, or maybe coming to a city near you. It's just great to hear from him as always. So again, thanks everybody for checking out the new audio and video podcast. Now we'll be posting this on YouTube on the lighter side of serial killers. So again, thanks for tuning in, and until next time, see ya.